December 2nd, 2023, 8:16 a.m., Maui, Hawaii. Ethan and Mariah Blake had been married just 7 days. They looked like every newlywed couple, laughing, holding hands, planning the rest of their lives. Then, in the middle of that perfect morning, something went wrong. A scream echoed across Wailea Bay. Lifeguards ran. Tourists pointed. The water turned red. Minutes later, Mariah was gone. Ethan stood on the sand, silent, dry, staring at the sea. At first, it seemed like a tragic accident. But the more investigators looked, the less it made sense. Because what happened that morning wasn't about the ocean. It was about everything that came before it.
530, we're north of the Alloway, 53rd Street, Marty Mercy 25.
They met in the most ordinary way. Two strangers brought together by a hospital fundraiser in downtown Denver, April 2022. Mariah Carter was a 59-year-old nurse who had spent most of her adult life putting others first. She was a widow, steady, grounded, the kind of woman her co-workers described as the calm in the storm. Ethan Blake was the opposite in almost every way. 29, smooth-talking, sharp dresser, and always selling something, even when he wasn't trying to. To anyone watching that night, it looked innocent. A polite conversation by the wine table, a shared laugh, a promise to keep in touch. But within weeks, that small spark would turn into a relationship that caught everyone off guard. At first, the age gap was the talk of their circles. 30 years between them, yet somehow it seemed to work. Ethan made Mariah feel young again. He called her my anchor, sent flowers to her work, and showed up at family cookouts with charm that disarmed everyone in the room. Her friends loved seeing her smile again, but privately, some of them admitted they couldn't quite read him. "He's almost too perfect," one coworker later recalled. "He compliments everyone but never really opens up about himself." Still, Mariah defended him. "He's just private. He's been through things." Those who knew her best said that was her weakness, always believing she could heal broken people. By fall of that same year, the relationship had gone public. Their social media accounts looked like a highlight reel: ski trips in Aspen, vineyard dinners, candlelit photos captioned with 2 hearts, 1 future. They appeared inseparable. Ethan's confidence mixed perfectly with her stability. He called her his miracle, and she called him the best surprise life ever gave me. Their pictures drew hundreds of comments, many praising how love could find anyone, at any age. Yet a few of Mariah's closest friends noticed her pulling back. She stopped joining her weekly coffee group, started missing family events, and once admitted she was just exhausted trying to keep up with work and life. Still, whenever questions came up about Ethan, she laughed them off. "He said love is the best investment," she told a friend with a grin. "I guess I'm all in." Those words would echo later, part joke, part prophecy. Around that same time, Ethan had begun to bring up financial planning during casual conversations, suggesting life insurance and joint investments as ways to build their future. Mariah thought it was practical. Her sister, Denise, didn't. "You've only known him a few months," Denise warned. "Don't sign anything until you're sure." Mariah brushed it off, saying, "He's helping me understand things I never cared about before." Behind that warmth, Ethan had his own story. He'd filed for bankruptcy 3 years earlier, following the collapse of a small investment startup he founded in Denver. According to court records, he owed nearly $180,000 in personal debt. To his friends, he blamed it on bad luck and greedy partners. But in reality, investigators later learned, most of the losses came from his own trading habits: quick profits, high risks, and a habit of overpromising. By the time he met Mariah, he'd reinvented himself as a financial consultant, working from home, chasing clients mostly online. To her, he looked successful, confident, independent, always on his phone closing deals. When Ethan proposed in early 2023, it wasn't in private. It was on the balcony of a mountain lodge in front of her family. He told her, "You're my second chance." She said yes before the applause faded. Friends described it as emotional, almost cinematic. But a few noticed something odd. He'd prepared every detail. The photographer, the timing, even the champagne label matching their initials. It felt rehearsed, one relative later told investigators. Like he was performing the moment, not living it. Before we go further into this story, if you found yourself already pulled into their world, pause for a moment. Hit like, subscribe, and share. It's the only way we know you're still with us. Because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you understood about love, trust, and the limits of human control. By January 2023, Ethan Blake had already begun laying the foundation for what he called their future. He told Mariah he wanted to be the kind of man who planned ahead, the kind of husband who thought about stability, security, and legacy. For a woman who had spent years building her life around caring for others, those words struck a chord. She trusted him. And trust, once given, can be the most valuable currency in any relationship. He suggested they look into life insurance together, something that protects us both, he said over dinner one evening at the Capitol Grill in downtown Denver. A waiter nearby later remembered how she smiled when he slid a brochure across the table, the kind with a couple holding hands under soft light. She said, "You really think of everything." He replied, "I just don't ever want anything to happen to you without a plan." Behind that calm voice, Ethan had other motives. Court filings would later show that at the time of that dinner, he was behind on 3 separate credit accounts totaling nearly $80,000. His investment firm, an independent consultancy registered under Blake & Associates Financial Group, had lost 2 major clients and was under state review for alleged mismanagement. The Colorado Secretary of State's records show a notice of administrative dissolution had been issued just 3 weeks before his wedding proposal. But to Mariah, he was everything stable men were supposed to be: organized, confident, and reassuring. She had no reason to question that the insurance forms he was helping her fill out were a simple gesture of love. The first policy was modest, $250,000, arranged through an agent Ethan knew personally. The paperwork listed Mariah as the insured, Ethan as the primary beneficiary, and his firm's address as the mailing contact. It was presented as a joint financial step, something couples often did when blending lives. But over the next few months, the numbers shifted quietly. In March, he convinced her to increase the policy to $500,000. By June, it reached $1.2 million. In mid-November, just days before their wedding, the amount finalized at $2 million. The official change forms bore his signature, marked "Authorized Spouse." The insurance company later confirmed he'd personally handled every amendment. When investigators reviewed the sequence of documents, the timing raised questions. Each increase coincided with a major debt payment made by Ethan or a failed investment registered to his firm's business account. Friends who had once invested with him said he often talked about turning the tide, promising returns that never came. One former associate, a man named Daniel Reed, later told detectives, "Ethan was always chasing something bigger: money, recognition, the feeling that he'd finally made it. When he couldn't earn it, he looked for shortcuts." Mariah never saw those side conversations. To her, Ethan was still the man who opened doors, remembered birthdays, and told her she was the calm after a decade of storms. She wasn't naive. She'd been through loss before, but she believed this time was different. When her best friend, Carla Jenkins, voiced concern, saying, "He's too calculated. Every move feels like a business pitch," Mariah brushed it aside with a laugh. "He just likes to be prepared," she said. "You can tell he's used to handling things himself." The closer the wedding got, the more control Ethan assumed over their financial life. He created a shared folder labeled Future Planning, storing spreadsheets, insurance PDFs, and projections that looked legitimate. He even drafted emails for Mariah to send to her HR department about adjusting her retirement plan. On paper, it appeared she was the one requesting the changes, but email headers later showed they originated from his IP address. In one message retrieved from his old laptop, he wrote to himself, "Everything secured. No more risks after Deck 2. Ethan's charm covered every inconsistency. He had the patience of a salesman who'd practiced his story until it sounded natural. He could tell her about compounded interest or retirement dividends with the same tenderness most men use to describe love. And for a woman like Mariah, who'd spent decades saving every receipt, budgeting every trip, that sounded like care. He told her, "I don't want you worrying about money ever again." She replied, "I've never been with anyone who said that and meant it." But behind closed doors, his tone was different. A former neighbor in their Denver apartment building recalled hearing arguments late at night. Nothing loud, just muffled words that always ended with his voice saying, "You don't trust me. That's the problem." That line would appear again in her text messages weeks later. On November 18th, 2 weeks before their flight to Hawaii, Mariah texted her sister, "He's been under a lot of pressure. I think it's work. I just need to be patient." Denise replied, "Be patient, but be careful too." By that time, Ethan's debt collectors had started calling, again. He had maxed out 2 business credit cards and taken a short-term personal loan of $35,000 using his company as collateral. The payment due date was set for mid-December, just 2 weeks after their honeymoon. Investigators would later describe the timing as financially strategic. It meant that if something happened to Mariah before then, the policy payout would arrive in time to cover his outstanding obligations and leave him solvent again. Still, everything looked picture perfect from the outside. The wedding went on as planned. White roses, soft jazz, and vows that sounded like poetry. "Forever isn't a promise," he told her in front of family and friends. "It's a plan." Those words, captured on video, would later play before a courtroom audience months after his arrest. At the time, though, they sounded romantic, almost prophetic. He sealed them with a kiss, while in his jacket pocket sat a folded insurance confirmation letter. After the ceremony, as guests laughed and danced under the lights, Ethan excused himself for a few minutes, saying he needed to call the caterer. Security footage from the venue's side office later showed him standing alone, scrolling through emails and signing into his insurance account. Investigators recovered the login timestamp, 10:42 p.m., just before the final dance. He spent 3 minutes on the site, long enough to confirm the updated policy value. Mariah's friends would later replay that entire night in their minds, trying to spot what they missed. Carla said, "He was charming, polite, helpful, helped carry the gifts to the car. Nothing felt off." Another guest who worked in finance told police, "He talked a lot about investments, even at the reception. I thought it was odd to bring that up at your own wedding." That was Ethan Blake, always presenting charm as competence. He knew how to turn professionalism into intimacy, how to make a spreadsheet sound like affection. He wrapped deception in politeness and wore sincerity like a perfectly fitted suit. Mariah saw those traits as reassurance. She believed she'd finally found someone who could take care of her after years of taking care of everyone else. But paperwork doesn't lie, even when people do. Every page Ethan filed, every signature he forged, every payment he adjusted left a digital footprint. It would later become the backbone of the case against him, a trail that showed how one man turned love into a financial plan. On the night before they flew to Maui, Mariah stayed up late packing. Ethan sat beside her, typing on his laptop. She asked, "Are you sure you don't want to leave work behind for a week?" He smiled without looking up. "I just need to finish one last thing," he said. That one last thing was an online submission confirming the policy's beneficiary clause. By midnight, their honeymoon bags were zipped. Their photos from that night show them smiling in the kitchen, her in a robe, him holding a glass of wine. But a closer look at the background reveals his laptop screen glowing with the open policy portal. And while the world saw a couple about to begin their future, Ethan Blake saw something else entirely. A plan, finally complete. The next morning, they boarded their flight to Maui, 2 seats by the window, newlyweds in love. What Mariah didn't know was that the future she'd ensured wasn't hers to live. It was already written in someone else's balance sheet. 6 days after the wedding, the island of Maui welcomed Ethan and Mariah Blake the way it welcomed every newlywed couple. Soft waves brushing white sand, the air heavy with salt and sunlight. Their resort suite overlooked Wiley Bay, a place where mornings started with coffee on the balcony and ended with sunsets that could convince anyone life was perfect. Mariah posted a photo on her Facebook page the night they arrived. 2 glasses of champagne, his hand resting over hers, the caption reading, "Forever starts now." It looked effortless, but even through the glow of vacation photos, those close to her noticed a shift. Her sister, Denise, later told investigators that Mariah sounded tired the night before that post. In a text sent at 9:12 p.m., she wrote, "He's been quiet today. I can't tell if something's wrong or if it's just me." Denise replied with a heart emoji, followed by, "Don't overthink it. Maybe he's just taking it all in." But Mariah didn't respond. The next message from her phone would never be read by her sister until weeks later, when detectives handed it to her as evidence. The resort staff remembered the couple differently. Ethan was polite, measured, always the one handling check-ins and room arrangements. He asked for a villa closer to the beach, saying his wife wanted to wake up to the sound of the ocean. But when one employee congratulated them on their honeymoon, she remembered Ethan saying, "Yeah, it's been a long time coming," with a flat tone, like he was reciting lines he'd already said too many times. Mariah, on the other hand, was kind and chatty. She spent time at the pool bar, complimenting the staff, talking about how she used to nurse patients recovering from heart surgeries. One bartender told reporters later, "She was the kind of woman who asked about your family before she talked about herself. You could tell she was genuine." Ethan's habits were different. Resort surveillance logs show that on December 2, 2023, the day of the incident, his smartwatch registered activity as early as 6:47 a.m. GPS data placed him walking alone along the shoreline behind the resort, while Mariah's device remained still inside the villa. He later told police he'd gone out to check the tide. But his watch data revealed a gap, an unexplained 22-minute window where movement stopped completely before resuming near the same location. That detail would later become crucial in reconstructing what happened next. Mariah was last seen alive around 7:45 a.m., sipping orange juice on the balcony, talking with housekeeping staff who came to deliver towels. She told them, "My husband's planning something this morning, but he won't tell me what." That small, innocent comment would later echo through every police report. Witnesses recalled seeing the couple heading toward the beach around 8 a.m. Ethan carrying a snorkel bag, Mariah wearing a sun hat and sarong. According to one witness, she looked nervous, like she didn't really want to go. At 8:16 a.m., the first scream was heard. Tourists on the northern end of Wiley Bay turned their cameras toward the water, expecting maybe dolphins or someone playing around. What they captured instead was confusion. The ocean churned violently near the reef line, and people started shouting. Lifeguards were on the scene within minutes. One of them, Chris Layton, later said, "We heard screaming, but it stopped real fast. When we got there, there was just blood in the water." Ethan was found on the shore, standing motionless, fully dry. Witnesses said his hands were at his sides, his expression blank. When a lifeguard ran toward him yelling, "Where is she?" Ethan replied calmly, "She went under. The shark came out of nowhere." He repeated that phrase twice. "She went under. The shark came out of nowhere." His voice didn't shake, his breathing didn't change, and that stillness became one of the first things investigators found difficult to explain. The timeline that followed was strange. Beachgoers said Ethan never entered the water during the rescue attempts. One tourist told the Maui Police Department, "He didn't even look wet. I thought maybe he froze, like shock or something, but he wasn't crying. He just stood there." Another witness who filmed part of the aftermath caught Ethan on camera turning away from the chaos, pressing his phone to his ear. He later told officers he was calling 911, but phone records showed that his first outgoing call wasn't made until 8:26 a.m., nearly 10 minutes after the scream. When officers arrived at 8:33 a.m., Ethan gave a statement that sounded rehearsed. "We were snorkeling near the reef. I turned to grab the camera and she was gone. Then I saw a fin. I swam back, but it was too late." Investigators noted that his clothes were completely dry, and his smartwatch data, later pulled through a warrant, showed no heart rate spike consistent with panic or physical exertion. He also claimed to have run for help, yet multiple witnesses saw him remain in the same spot for several minutes. As search boats combed the area, the resort staff gathered guests back to safety. The bay was closed to swimmers. Within an hour, news alerts began circulating about a possible shark fatality. By noon, local news stations were broadcasting images of Ethan being consoled by responders. He sat on a bench, near the lifeguard tower, head in hands. But one officer later said, "He was crying, but there weren't any tears." Mariah's body was never recovered. Only fragments of torn fabric and a single gold wedding ring were found floating near the reef line. Ethan identified it hours later at the coroner's office. "That's hers," he said quietly, barely glancing at the evidence bag. The technician noted that he didn't ask to hold it, didn't flinch, and didn't request to see any other personal items. That evening, while investigators prepared their preliminary report, Ethan returned to the resort. He told management he wanted to collect their belongings. Staff members recalled that he appeared calm, even composed, and requested a full refund for the remaining days of their stay. When one employee apologized for the tragedy, he reportedly said, "Things happen. It's just life." Those words unsettled everyone who heard them. In the following 24 hours, the media coverage exploded. Headlines called it the Maui honeymoon tragedy. Family and friends in Colorado were devastated. Denise told reporters, "She was terrified of deep water. There's no way she went out there willingly." That single statement prompted detectives to re-examine Ethan's account. What they found began to fracture his story. Hotel keycard logs showed that at 6:52 a.m., Ethan left the room alone. At 7:01, he used his card again to re-enter for 2 minutes. Investigators believe he might have retrieved something, though what that was remains unclear. His smartwatch placed him back on the sand at 7:25, far earlier than he claimed. When questioned, Ethan said, "I must have forgotten the time." But digital timestamps rarely forget, and as the sun set over Wiley Bay that evening, reporters gathered along the shoreline where it all began. The waves rolled in as they always did, washing away footprints but not suspicion. Ethan boarded his return flight to Denver 2 days later, alone. He wore sunglasses the entire time. Airline staff described him as quiet and polite. When asked by a passenger if he was the man from the news, he simply nodded and said, "That's me." The story that started as a tragic accident was beginning to shift. Authorities weren't just looking at the ocean anymore. They were looking at everything that led them there, and what they would soon uncover would turn Maui's peaceful paradise into the center of one of the most chilling investigations Hawaii had ever seen. That was the last sunrise Mariah ever trusted. If you're still watching this story, drop your location in the comments below. And if you've made it this far, type, "I'm still here," so we'll know who's following every turn of this case. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about that morning in Maui. By the next morning, the story already had a name. On television screens and phone alerts across the country, the headline was simple and heartbreaking. "Tragic honeymoon shark attack in Maui." Anchors spoke in somber tones about a newlywed couple whose dream trip had ended in terror. They showed the same photo over and over, Ethan and Mariah on the beach, her head resting on his shoulder, both of them smiling at the camera. Viewers heard the basic outline. December 2nd, 2023. Wiley Bay, reported shark activity, a missing woman, no body recovered. It sounded like an awful accident, the kind that people shake their heads at and then move on from. A few hours after that first wave of coverage, the official statement from law enforcement went out. Standing in front of a backdrop with the department seal, a spokesperson read from a prepared sheet. "At this time," she said, We have no evidence of foul play in the disappearance of 59-year-old visitor Mariah Blake. She explained that based on witness accounts, water conditions, and marks observed in the area, investigators believed a shark encounter was the most likely explanation. When a reporter asked if the husband was under suspicion, the spokesperson answered, "Mr. Blake has been cooperative. There is nothing at this stage that indicates criminal involvement." The words were careful, neutral, and final sounding, exactly the kind of language that tells the public a case can be filed away in their minds. Back in Colorado, the people who knew Mariah were processing the news in a very different way. Her co-workers at the hospital gathered in the break room, staring at her photo on someone's phone. One nurse whispered, "She finally got her happy ending, and this is how it turns out." At her home church, a special prayer service was held that Sunday. Friends lit candles and shared stories about the nurse who stayed late with frightened patients and brought homemade soup to grieving families. Ethan did not attend that first gathering. He was still in contact with the authorities, still on the island, still appearing in footage that played on loop. To many watching from afar, he looked like the picture of a devastated husband. To others, something about that calm expression bothered them, though they couldn't quite say why. When he finally returned to Denver, cameras were waiting at the airport. Ethan walked through the arrivals area in a plain shirt and jeans, sunglasses covering his eyes. A reporter stepped forward and asked, "Ethan, do you want to say anything about Mariah?" He paused, took a breath, and said quietly, "She loved that trip. She talked about Hawaii for months. I keep thinking if I'd been closer to her in the water, maybe I could have done something. I lost my wife out there. That's all I can say right now." His voice cracked at the right moments. His shoulders slumped in a way that looked almost rehearsed, and then he let his attorney guide him past the microphones. On screen, it played as raw emotion. In living rooms across Colorado, people shook their heads and said, "Poor man." For Mariah's family, the official story settled in more slowly. They sat together in Denise's living room, watching the coverage, listening to the statement from police, trying to accept what they were being told. Ethan called that night, his voice low and strained. "I'm so sorry," he said over the speakerphone. "I did everything I could. It happened so fast." Denise answered, "We're praying for you, Ethan." Because that's what she was raised to say in moments like that. But when the call ended, she stared at the black screen of her TV and felt something she couldn't shake. Mariah had been afraid of deep water since they were kids. She avoided lakes. She stayed close to shore at family trips. That memory pushed its way to the front of her mind during a later newscast, when a reporter repeated the detail that Mariah had been snorkeling alone beyond the reef. Denise turned to the rest of the family and finally spoke the question that had been tightening in her chest all day. "Why would she snorkel alone?" she asked. "She's terrified of deep water. She doesn't even like standing where she can't touch the bottom." That doesn't sound like her. The room went quiet. Her words didn't accuse anyone outright, but they cracked something open that the official statement had tried to seal. Quietly, her niece replied, Maybe there's more to this than what they're saying on the news." Miles away, in an office with no cameras and no microphones, a detective was thinking the same thing. He had been the one to sign off on the initial case report, marking it as a likely shark incident based on the evidence available at the scene. But as tips began to come in, messages from family about her fear of the ocean, a note from a local officer who thought Ethan's timeline sounded too polished, mention of a life insurance policy, he pulled the file back onto his desk. He watched the beach footage once more, this time paying attention not just to the water but to the man on the sand. He read the transcript of Ethan's statement again, line by line, noticing how often he repeated certain phrases and skipped over others. Then he opened the case management system, moved the cursor to the status field, and changed a single word. What had been filed as closed was now marked under review. And in that small, quiet act, away from headlines, away from public sympathy, the real story began. By the time the case file landed back on the detective's desk, It no longer looked like a clean accident. What science was beginning to show didn't fit the story the world had already accepted. The first break came from a small brown pouch that had been collected from Mariah's toiletry kit at the resort. It was part of the standard evidence sweep, logged but never examined closely until a forensic technician decided to test every item inside. When the lab results came back, one detail stood out in red ink. Traces of midazolam, a controlled hospital sedative, were found on a small travel bottle and on the lining of her toothbrush holder. The drug is typically used for anesthesia and short medical procedures. It's not sold over the counter. The only people who usually have access to it are licensed medical professionals. When investigators confronted Ethan about the discovery, he didn't seem surprised. "She took medication for anxiety," he said, his tone even, almost dismissive. But that claim quickly fell apart. Mariah's doctor confirmed she had never been prescribed anything of that kind. Toxicologists analyzing the samples explained what a dose of midazolam could do, how it slows reflexes, clouds memory, and can cause loss of consciousness, especially when mixed with alcohol. The night before she disappeared, resort staff had delivered a bottle of white wine to their villa, signed for by Ethan. One of the waiters remembered him saying, "She could use something to relax tonight." That same bottle was later found half empty, with 2 glasses still on the table. Forensic specialists traced the origin of the drug through its serial batch code. The source led to a prescription written months earlier by a retired anesthesiologist who had once been one of Ethan's financial clients. The man told detectives that Ethan had offered to handle some paperwork for him involving tax refunds and insurance claims. Investigators believed Ethan had taken the opportunity to obtain access to the doctor's online prescription portal. The retired physician said in his statement, "I never authorized him to get medication. I thought it was just financial stuff. I can't believe he used my name for that." When toxicologists expanded their testing, they found that Mariah's bloodstream, collected from samples on the towels and sheets, contained levels of midazolam far beyond a therapeutic dose. Combined with alcohol, it would have made her drowsy and unable to swim. The forensic team later wrote in their report that the timing of the ingestion, roughly 45 minutes before the estimated time of death, indicated deliberate administration. The dosage wasn't accidental. Then came the detail that tied everything together: Ethan's smartwatch. Initially, investigators had focused on the device for his movement data, but digital forensic specialists uncovered something unexpected. Ethan had paired his watch with Mariah's phone through a family-sharing sync feature. It meant that certain health metrics and timestamps from one device could be mirrored onto the other without the user realizing it. Within that shared data, analysts found an entry time-stamped at 7:29 a.m., a heart rate spike registered not from Ethan's body, but from Mariah's watch as the drug entered her system. Moments later, her vitals slowed rapidly before cutting off entirely. Ethan's own heart rate, recorded simultaneously, remained steady. The digital evidence effectively captured a timeline of control, her body shutting down while his remained calm. When detectives replayed the sequence for the lead prosecutor, the room fell silent. There was no shark in that data. There was only a person who had planned, waited, and watched. The next morning, the case classification was officially changed from accidental shark encounter to suspicious death pending further investigation. A confidential memo circulated internally, stating that new forensic evidence strongly contradicts initial findings of a natural or environmental cause. Ethan was called in again for questioning. The lead investigator asked, "Can you explain how your wife's belongings tested positive for a restricted anesthetic?" He paused for several seconds before answering, "Maybe she packed it from her hospital days. You know she was a nurse." The detective responded, "That drug isn't available in hospitals like hers, and it's not something anyone just keeps around." Ethan folded his arms, stared at the table, and muttered, "You're reading too much into it." In the lab, technicians examined the last of the evidence, the 2 wine glasses taken from the villa. One showed traces of ethanol and faint midazolam residue. The other was clean. The pattern suggested one glass had been used to deliver the sedative. It was a small, cold detail, but it was the kind that told the truth better than any witness ever could. Science was rewriting the story Ethan had built so carefully. Every data point, every chemical trace, every digital timestamp pointed to intent. The ocean had taken Mariah's body, but the evidence she left behind was enough to speak for her. If you've been following this story, don't just watch. Protect yourself and those you love. Cases like this remind us that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Make sure the people closest to you are as genuine as they seem. Like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can recognize the warning signs before it's too late. Because what investigators found next would expose a truth even more shocking than the science itself. By the time the lab reports were printed and the word suspicious appeared on the case file, detectives knew they had to look beyond the ocean. If the science proved Mariah hadn't simply slipped beneath the waves, then someone had helped push her there. The first place they turned was the one thing Ethan thought he'd erased completely: his phone. A digital forensics team pulled his device image and got to work, sifting through backups, cloud syncs, and fragments of conversations he thought were gone forever. Hidden in that digital rubble was a name that had never shown up in any of his statements, a name that did not belong to Mariah at all: Tessa Monroe. At first, it looked like nothing more than a contact entry. No recent calls, no visible texts. But the cyber unit knew how to read between the gaps. Through a recovered cloud backup, they restored thousands of messages that had been deleted in the days leading up to the honeymoon. Those texts painted a very different picture of Ethan than the grieving husband the public thought they knew. Tessa was a casino hostess in Las Vegas, someone he had met 8 months earlier on a work trip. The first messages were flirtatious, then quickly moved into something deeper: pet names, late-night calls, photographs, and endless conversations about leaving everything behind. One text from Ethan, dated April 17, 2023, still stunned the detective who read it. "Once this is behind me, we'll be free. No more stress, no more pretending." Tessa's reply popped up moments later. "I just want a real life with you. No secrets." At that point, he was already engaged to Mariah. He never mentioned her by name in those conversations, but he referred often to the situation, the paperwork, and a plan that has to be done right. 8 months of messages built a pattern. It wasn't just a fling. It was a second life, waiting for the first one to end. Bank records confirmed what the messages suggested. Investigators found regular transfers from Ethan's accounts to Tessa's, small amounts at first, then larger ones as the wedding date approached. He'd paid for flights, hotel stays, and a string of weekend meetups in Las Vegas that were disguised on his statements as client entertainment. Hotel receipts showed him checking in as E. Blake business traveler, while security footage showed him and Tessa walking through casino lobbies hand in hand. One hotel manager later told detectives, "They didn't act like people hiding an affair. They acted like a couple who thought nobody was watching." When detectives flew out to question Tessa, she looked nothing like the paper villain people might imagine. She was in her early 30s, tired-looking, and nervous as she sat across from the two investigators. At first, she insisted she had nothing to do with whatever happened in Hawaii. "I thought they went there to get married and start over," she said. When they showed her the insurance documents and the toxicology report, she covered her mouth with her hands. One of the detectives asked, "What did you think he meant when he said, 'Once this is behind me, we'll be free'?" Her answer was quiet but clear. "I thought he meant divorce," she said, eyes filling with tears. "Not death. I never thought he meant death." The more they showed her, the more the shape of Ethan's plan became obvious. There were messages where he complained about being trapped in a dead-end situation and talked about needing a clean exit. In one exchange, he wrote, "You deserve better than this half-built life. Give me time. There are things I have to finish first. Investment stuff, contracts, you know how it is." She had responded, "I don't care about money. I just want you." But money, as the evidence made clear, was at the center of everything Ethan did. The investment talk he'd charmed Mariah with, calling love the best investment, read differently now. It wasn't romance, it was motive. When the affair became public, the story exploded. News outlets that once called Ethan a tragic widower now plastered his face next to the words secret lover and double life. Comment sections filled with anger, disbelief, and suspicion. Headlines began to use a new phrase, the honeymoon killer. The same video of Ethan standing dry on the beach now played under a different narrative. People replayed his interviews, studying his eyes, his tone, the way he talked about fate and accidents. The sympathy he once received evaporated almost overnight. Back in Colorado, Mariah's family watched the coverage with a mix of heartbreak and rage. Denise said in one interview, "I kept asking myself, how could we have missed this? But he fooled all of us. He looked my sister in the eye and promised her forever while planning something else behind her back." Her words resonated far beyond their town, tapping into something many viewers feared deep down, that you can share a bed, a ring, and a future with someone, and still never really know what they're capable of. For investigators, the recovered messages and financial records weren't just emotional blows, they were bricks in a wall of evidence. The affair showed motive, a man who wanted out, who wanted a fresh start with someone younger, someone unconnected to his debts and failures. The insurance policies showed a payout big enough to erase his financial problems. The sedative traces showed method. And now, the texts with Tessa showed intent. He wasn't just unlucky. He was planning. One evening, as the lead detective reviewed the printed transcripts, he paused on a short message Ethan had sent 2 weeks before the trip. "Once everything is finished, we'll have everything we ever talked about. Trust me." The phrase, "trust me," had appeared again and again, spoken to Mariah about financial security, and written to Tessa about a promised future. Trust was the one thing he kept asking for, while giving none of it back. By the time the cyber unit handed over their final report, there was no way to keep pretending this was an accident. The ocean had been the stage, not the cause. The money was the reason. And the other woman was the mirror that reflected who Ethan really was when he thought no one else was watching. Hidden motives had finally surfaced. And as the case left the quiet halls of the forensic labs and stepped into the spotlight of the courtroom, one question hung over everything. Now that the world had seen the man behind the mask, what would a jury do with the story he'd worked so hard to sell? When detectives thought they had uncovered every possible lead, a single audio file changed everything. It was stored deep in Mariah's phone backup, labeled simply as voicemail, Nov 30. The timestamp was 2 days before the Maui trip. When investigators pressed play, her voice came through, calm, tender, and carrying the kind of warmth that makes silence after it feel unbearable. "Mom," she said softly, "if anything happens to me, tell the girls I love them. I don't know why, but I just feel like I need to say that. I'll call you when we get back, okay?" Then a small pause. "I love you." That was it. No panic, no drama, just instinct. The room went silent as her family listened to it for the first time. Denise sat still, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her daughters stood behind her, tears streaming down their faces. When the message ended, nobody spoke. Finally, Denise whispered, "She knew. Somehow she knew." The lead investigator standing nearby removed his glasses and said quietly, "That's the kind of message people record when they're not sure they'll come home." For the family, that voicemail was no longer just evidence. It was a goodbye they hadn't realized they'd already received. The discovery of that recording spread quickly through the department. Detectives who'd worked the case for months played it on repeat in their offices. It wasn't something they needed for forensics. It was something they needed for perspective. They'd read Mariah's texts, her emails, her posts, but hearing her voice made her real again. She wasn't just a victim in a report or a name on an evidence tag. She was a woman who loved deeply, who trusted too easily, and who sensed danger even when it hid behind a smile. In early March, months after her death, the community held a candlelight vigil at Wiley Bay. The same beach that had once been filled with police tape and camera crews was now lined with lanterns and photographs. Nurses from Mariah's old hospital flew in to attend. They wore their scrubs and carried small paper lanterns, each with her initials written in marker. As the sun set, they stood in silence and let the wind carry the light toward the horizon. One nurse spoke softly into the microphone, her voice shaking. For every patient she cared for, she gave comfort. Tonight, we return that comfort to her. Reporters captured the moment, but no headline could really describe it. This wasn't the kind of grief that demanded attention. It was quiet, patient, and full of love. For a brief moment, everyone there forgot about the court dates, the evidence, and the man who caused it all. They focused on Mariah, the laughter she brought to her coworkers, the warmth she gave to friends, and the way her family described her as the light that filled every room. Investigators stood at the edge of the sand watching as the candles drifted out of sight. One turned to the lead detective and said, "I've worked hundreds of cases, but this one feels personal." The detective nodded, eyes fixed on the waves. "It's personal," he said quietly, "because she trusted him, and trust shouldn't cost someone their life." That evening marked the emotional calm before the courtroom storm that was about to begin. Prosecutors were preparing their arguments, witnesses were being flown in, and Ethan Blake, now formally charged with first-degree murder, was days away from facing the people he had deceived. The evidence was stacked, the timeline was airtight, and the world was ready to hear the truth in full. If this story has moved you, thank you for standing with us. Your support helps us tell the stories that matter, stories of justice, of truth, and of voices that refuse to stay silent. Join our channel membership today to help us keep uncovering these hidden stories. And together, let's make sure no voice like Mariah's is ever forgotten again. August 2024, Honolulu Circuit Court. The air outside was thick with humidity and news cameras. Reporters lined the steps, waiting for the man who once smiled for wedding photos in Maui. Ethan Blake arrived in a dark suit, flanked by his defense attorneys, walking past the cameras without a glance. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Family, reporters, and members of the public filled every seat. Some were there for justice, others for curiosity. But everyone understood that this was no longer about the sea. It was about what the sea had revealed. From the very first moment, prosecutors set the tone. They called it a crime disguised as an act of nature. Their presentation was meticulous. They displayed a digital map showing Ethan's smartwatch data, the movements before and after the attack, the 22-minute window where his motion stopped, and the mirrored sync between his watch and Mariah's phone. "Technology doesn't lie," the lead prosecutor said. "It records truth in real time, even when people don't." Jurors leaned forward as timestamps appeared on the screen. 7:29 a.m., 7:45, 8:16. The precise chain of events showing a woman slipping from consciousness while her husband's pulse never rose. The toxicology expert took the stand next, holding up the forensic chart that displayed traces of midazolam and ethanol. "This combination," he said, "would render an average adult unable to stand or swim. It's consistent with sedation, not accident." He explained how the traces in her toiletry bag matched the residue on the wine glass. Then came the retired anesthesiologist, the man whose prescription pad Ethan had exploited. "I never gave him authorization to use my account," the witness said firmly. "He stole my credentials. I had no idea until the DEA contacted me." The jurors glanced at Ethan, who sat expressionless, his jaw tight. When prosecutors introduced the marine forensics expert, the courtroom fell silent. Using underwater mapping and forensic modeling, the expert demonstrated how shark attacks leave distinct wound patterns. "In this case," he said, pointing to enlarged photos, "the bite marks show post-mortem predation. That means the victim was already motionless, likely unconscious or deceased, when the shark encountered her body." A murmur swept through the gallery. One juror covered her mouth. The prosecutor let the moment hang before adding, "Nature didn't kill Mariah Blake. It simply revealed what had already been done." Ethan's defense team tried to regain control. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial. that data could be misinterpreted, and that grief affects behavior. My client froze, the defense attorney argued. People react differently in shock. But when cross-examined, Ethan's version began to crumble. Prosecutors replayed his own police interview from December 2023, highlighting inconsistencies in his timeline. In one clip, he said they entered the water together. In another, he claimed she went in first. When asked why his smartwatch showed no exertion, Ethan replied, "Maybe the device glitched." The prosecutor looked directly at the jury and said, "It didn't glitch when it recorded the life insurance login, did it?" The final blow came with the financial evidence. A forensic accountant walked the court through the policy trail, from the original $250,000 coverage to the quietly updated $2 million plan signed just 10 days before the honeymoon. The signature, verified by handwriting experts, belonged to Ethan. This wasn't just foresight, the prosecutor said. It was premeditation disguised as paperwork. On the screen behind him, photos of Mariah smiling on her wedding day transitioned into the insurance form bearing his name. As the day stretched into evening, the courtroom atmosphere grew heavier. Mariah's family sat behind the prosecution table, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the man who had once promised to protect her. When the final witness, the digital forensic analyst, finished testifying about the synchronized devices and deleted files, the judge called for recess. The audience stayed silent, the kind of silence that says everything words can't. When court resumed, Ethan took the stand for the first time. His attorney asked him to describe the morning of December 2nd. "It was supposed to be a good day," he began, voice trembling slightly. "She wanted to see the reef. I told her I'd meet her in the water. Then I heard the scream. I didn't even realize what happened until it was too late." The prosecutor stood up. "You expect this jury to believe your wife, who couldn't swim beyond waist-deep water, suddenly decided to snorkel alone?" Ethan looked down, silent. "And that you, a man standing 5 feet away, stayed dry the entire time?" The pause stretched for nearly 10 seconds before he answered. "I froze." The prosecutor leaned closer. "No, Mr. Blake, you planned." The defense objected. The judge sustained, but the damage was done. Ethan's composure faltered. His hands shook as he adjusted his tie. Jurors noticed. Cameras captured it. The man once praised for his calm demeanor now looked like someone watching the walls close in. When closing arguments arrived, the prosecutor's words were simple and precise. He thought the ocean would erase his crime, but the ocean gave her back, not in body, but in truth. It gave back every timestamp, every chemical trace, every lie he tried to wash away. Then he paused and looked directly at the jurors. Sometimes nature doesn't just witness, it testifies. As the courtroom lights dimmed and the judge adjourned for the day, the camera flashbulbs started again outside. Reporters called out questions, but Ethan said nothing. Inside, the jurors sat in deep silence, staring at the evidence that spoke louder than any defense ever could. The truth was no longer hidden beneath the waves. It was right there, in the data, in the science, and in the eyes of the man who thought he could outsmart both. And as night fell over Honolulu, one question echoed through the courthouse halls. When the verdict finally came, would justice carry the same weight as the sea that exposed it? August 16th, 2024, Honolulu Circuit Court. The jury room lights had burned late into the evening, papers scattered across the long oak table. Outside, reporters waited in the thick island air, cameras fixed on the double doors. After 6 hours of deliberation, the courtroom clerk appeared, a single envelope in hand. Inside, 12 signatures sealed the fate of the man who once called himself a husband. When the judge returned to the bench and the foreperson stood, not a sound moved through the gallery. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Blake, guilty of murder in the first degree." A gasp escaped from the second row. Mariah's sister covered her face, whispering, "She finally has peace." Ethan didn't look up. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the defense table. The judge took a long pause before speaking. She was deliberate, almost reverent in tone. "Mr. Blake," she began, "you weaponized the ocean. You turned nature into your accomplice. You plotted to let the sea bear the blame for your greed." Her words cut through the quiet, like the sharp pull of a tide. Ethan's eyes flickered toward the family section, but quickly fell again. He said nothing, only exhaled slowly, as though bracing himself for the weight that was about to follow. The judge continued, "You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The courtroom remained still for a few seconds, before the sound of quiet sobbing filled the back rows. The prosecutor's team didn't celebrate. They stood quietly as the bailiffs escorted Ethan away. One of them, a young detective who had joined the case late, later said, "It didn't feel like victory. It felt like gravity, like something heavy finally settled." Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Strangers who'd followed the case online for months stood together, holding signs that read, "Justice for Mariah." Cameras flashed as the prosecutor addressed the media. "Today," he said, "science, truth, and persistence spoke louder than deceit. The ocean took her, but it also gave her back." The clip ran across every major network that night. But for the people who loved Mariah, no sentence could fill the space she once occupied. Days later, under the golden light of an early September morning, Mariah's family gathered at Whaley Bay, the same beach that had once held their grief. The waves were calm again, as if the island itself understood the meaning of this return. Denise stood barefoot at the shoreline, holding a small urn. "She loved the sound of water," she said softly. "It's only right she rests here." One by one, her daughters stepped forward, scattering Mariah's ashes into the tide. The salt air carried them out in a slow silver arc before the wind folded it into the sea. No one spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the hush of the ocean, steady and forgiving. A few weeks earlier, divers had recovered a single item during a final sweep of the reef, a simple gold wedding band. The ring was scratched but intact, still bearing the engraving, "Forever starts now." Denise had kept it on her nightstand since then. But now, standing at the edge of the same water that had once deceived her family, she opened her palm and let it go. The ring caught the light for an instant, before slipping beneath the surface, vanishing quietly into the same sea that had witnessed everything. "She's home," Denise whispered. As the sun began to set, one of Mariah's co-workers turned to the camera crew and said, "People will talk about the case for years, but I hope they remember her for her kindness, not her death." Those words carried over the sound of the waves, a reminder that justice, no matter how complete, always leaves scars. The detectives stood nearby, watching the family walk away from the water. One of them said quietly, "You spend your life chasing the truth, but sometimes the truth feels heavier than the lie ever did." The ocean had taken her body, but it gave back everything else: the truth, the proof, and the peace her family had been searching for. And as night settled over Whaley Bay, the tide washed in one last time, carrying her story with it, a story no one would ever forget. In the months after the verdict, silence followed Ethan Blake like a shadow. He refused every interview request, turned down all media inquiries, and cut off contact with anyone outside his legal team. When reporters shouted questions through the gates of the correctional facility, "Do you feel remorse? Did you ever love her?" he kept his head down and walked on. Prison records showed he spent most of his days alone, reading finance books in the library and avoiding the recreation yard. The man who once sold charm as his greatest skill had nothing left to sell. And yet, somewhere beneath that silence, people still wondered whether he ever understood what he had destroyed. Outside those prison walls, the aftermath rippled far wider than anyone expected. Tessa Monroe, the Las Vegas hostess who had unknowingly stood at the edge of a murder plot, vanished from public life. Her last known sighting came from a small Nevada gas station 2 weeks after the sentencing. When a reporter approached her for comment, she simply said, "He told me he wanted freedom. I never thought it meant someone had to die for it." After that, she disappeared completely. No public records, No social media, no statements. Some said she left the country. Others believed she started over somewhere no one would recognize her name. For her, the truth was not closure. It was contamination. Mariah's family chose a different path. Her sister, Denise, spent months collecting letters from women who had written to her after the trial. Letters from people who had also been deceived, manipulated, or financially exploited in relationships they thought were built on love. The stories shared a common thread: betrayal dressed in devotion. Out of that pain, Denise created something lasting. In early 2025, she launched the Mariah Promise Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting victims of emotional and financial manipulation. Its mission statement read, "To protect those who trust too deeply from those who love for profit." At its first fundraiser in Denver, Denise stood at the podium and said, "My sister believed in the good in people. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure her kindness isn't what gets remembered as her weakness." The room rose in applause, and for the first time in months she smiled. Meanwhile, the island where it all began returned to its quiet rhythm. Wiley Bay, once the site of chaos and investigation, had gone back to being what it always was: beautiful and indifferent. Locals still remembered the week of helicopters and police tape, but most avoided talking about it. One fisherman, who had helped search for Mariah's remains, told a journalist years later, "That beach changed for me. Every time I go out, I think about how calm the water looked that morning and how much it was hiding underneath." His words became part of the quiet folklore of the island, spoken in low tones, like a lesson whispered on the wind. By the first anniversary of her death, the Blake story had become more than a case. It was a warning, a reflection on how easily love can be turned into a weapon. A documentary aired nationally that year, titled "Forever Starts Now," echoing the same words engraved inside Mariah's wedding ring. Viewers across the country watched, many in disbelief at how a man could transform affection into strategy and trust into currency. The closing interview featured the lead prosecutor, who said, "People think the ocean buried the evidence. It didn't. It just waited for the truth to float back up." And on one quiet morning, just as the sun began to rise over Wiley Bay, a lone diver returned to the reef where it all began. He wasn't there for a search, only reflection. Beneath the surface, the light filtered down through the clear blue water, illuminating the coral and the sand below. Among the shells and stones, a glint of gold still rested there, the ring, weathered but unbroken. It sat nestled among the rocks, untouched by time, its engraving barely visible now. The diver said later, "It was like the ocean decided to keep her story safe. He told everyone he married for love. Maybe he believed that. But love without trust isn't love at all. It's control wearing perfume." The ring sinks slowly, light shimmering around it, before it disappears once more into the depths. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories of love, lies, and justice. And remember, sometimes the truth doesn't surface until everything else is gone.